Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning everybody. My name is Madhvi Jha and I am from Janki Devi Memorial College, Department of History, University of Delhi. Today we will be speaking on Second World War 1939 to 1945. The interwar years came to be known as the 20 years truce, and the whole era between 1914 and 1945 as another 30 years war. There were many similarities between the two wars, as both began in Eastern Europe and both arose from treaty obligations towards smaller powers. Although the Second World War started in 1939, just like any other events in history, the causes for its outbreak started to take shape much earlier. In fact, it would not be exaggeration to say that the seeds of the Second World War were sown just after the end of the First World War. The genesis of the Second World War. Historian E. H. Carr has commented that in the Treaty of Versailles, the elements of dictation was more apparent than in any previous peace treaty of modern times. By this treaty, Germany was compelled by the victor nations to accept bitter humiliation and injustice. Though the war guilt clause, the German army was reduced drastically. The economic clauses were also severe for Germany, as she lost 15% of her arable land and 12% of her industrial areas. Added to this, the reparation payment and the deprivation of her colonies. The French occupation of Ruhr Valley deeply injured the German national sentiment. In the 1920s, Germany was going through an economic crisis due to hyperinflation and currency devaluation. This crisis was further aggravated due to the worldwide Great Depression of 1930s following the Wall Street crash of 1929. Economic crisis gave birth to social crisis. The maximum advantage of this situation was taken by Hitler and the Nazi Party. By denouncing the Treaty of Versailles, they strengthened their position and could then start a period of ultra-nationalism. Mentally, the Germans were against the treaty and Hitler only utilized the situation. The League of Nations was established with the ambitious aim of maintaining peace and stability. But in reality, the League could not establish itself as an international center of command, for the big powers were never ready to cooperate with each other on the various issues. Each power tried to use the League to serve its own ends. For example, Britain tried to use the League to corner Bolshevism. France regarded the League as an instrument to secure the Versailles Treaty, and Germany regarded the League as an assembly of the victorious nations. The final blow to the prestige of the League came when the League failed on the question of aggressions in Manchuria and Abyssinia. The disarmament initiatives ultimately failed. Germany was disarmed by the Treaty of Versailles, but the other powers were not ready for disarmament. The disarmament conferences called by the League resulted in a deadlock where France and other European nations refused to disarm by putting forward the argument of national security. When Hitler came to power in Germany, he started the process of armament. In 1935, conscription was allowed in Germany, and Japan and Italy too started armament. The arm race of the Axis powers thus started the competition for more and more armament. Finally, it must be remembered that imperialism and imperialist ambitions was also a cause of outbreak of Second World War. By the Treaty of Versailles, the Allied powers defended their imperialist interest but hit hard the imperialist interest of Germany and Italy. The bulk of the backward underdeveloped regions of the world were under the control of Britain, France, the US, etc., being deprived of colonies. Germany and Italy were facing a lack of raw materials, minerals, and markets. Out of 125 essential raw materials and minerals, Britain enjoyed adequate supply of 18, whereas Germany was compelled to remain content only with 4. Italy had no coal and Japan had no oil. Under these circumstances, it became necessary for the Axis powers to pursue a course of aggression to secure the question of raw materials and markets. A series of acts of aggression by Germany served as the immediate cause of the war. German invasion of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland made the war scene inevitable. These attacks and Hitler's non-aggression pact with Russia served as the spark to bring about conflagration. The attempt to the Allies to pacify the German by the Munich Pact failed. The war started in September 1939 and ended in 1945. Responsibility of Hitler for the Second World War. The Second World War has been seen and described as Hitler's war. Immediately after coming to power to 1933, Hitler established total control over Germany. He engaged the press, suspended civil rights, and banned trade unions, and took steps to ensure that the army was loyal to him alone. The book of unsuitable writers were burned. In June 1935, he ordered the killing of his political opponents, and hundreds of them were mercilessly killed in just one night, which we have seen in the last lecture on fascism. He imposed restrictions on the Jews. Political opponents were sent to concentration camps. The cruelty of the Nazi regime led to anti-Nazi demonstrations in many cities of Europe and the US. Thereafter, Hitler decided to proceed carefully. In foreign policy, Hitler gradually dismantled the Versailles system. As already discussed, in 1933, he withdrew from the League of Nations, and in 1935, a plebiscite enabled him to acquire the Saar region. In 1935, he announced that Germany would not be bound by the military clauses of the Treaty of Versailles, and in 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland. In 1938, he incorporated Austria and part of Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, he occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, and finally in September, he invaded Poland. Because of this ruthless policy of total control internally and expansion abroad, the responsibility of the war is placed on Hitler's shoulders. After the war, for about 2 decades, it was more or less accepted that it was Hitler who was responsible for the war. This line of argument suited the Germans because by placing responsibility for the outbreak of the war squarely on Hitler's shoulders, the rest of the Germans could be absolved. It seems Hitler had clear-cut aims: revenge for Versailles, inclusion of all German-speaking people in the Third Reich, which meant annexation of Austria and part of Czechoslovakia, and to gain living space for Germans in East Europe, which meant incorporation of Poland and Russia. By fulfilling these aims, he wanted to establish Germany's dominance in Europe. Once in power, Hitler showed total ruthlessness in achieving his goals, but in methods and tactics he was an improviser. But the fact that Hitler received such adulation in Germany and that not only ordinary citizens but also the most educated and accomplished sections of society support him cannot be ignored. Now, we will talk about the policy of appeasement adopted by the big powers of the Europe. The policy adopted by Britain and France of avoiding war by giving way to the demands of aggressive powers such as Germany, Italy and Japan has been described as the policy of appeasement. The origin of this policy is traced to the feeling in Britain that Germany and Italy had been treated too harshly in 1919 and that some revision of the terms of Versailles would remove the reason for resentment. France did adopt a firm policy towards Germany and sought to establish friendly relations with Italy and Soviet Union. But efforts to create any strong front against Germany remained hollow. In 1935, when Germany announced the program of remilitarization, Britain, France and Italy held a meeting at Stresa to demonstrate their outrage against this insolence of the Versailles Treaty. But no action was taken. The French government reacted by signing an agreement with Russia under which the two countries agreed to assist each other in the event of an unprovoked attack by Germany and also agreed to protect Czechoslovakia in case it was attacked by Germany. Britain reacted by signing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement under which Germany agreed to limit its shipbuilding to 35% of the level of Britain. This was a diplomatic triumph for Hitler because it demonstrated the hollowness of the Stresa front and meant no restraint because Germany was likely to take years to reach even this level. Britain tended to ignore the unpleasant features of Nazism in the hope that Hitler's Germany would form a buffer against communist expansion westwards. In March 1936, Hitler occupied the demilitarized Rhineland and Britain and France watched on. In the same year, war started in Spain between the repressive right-wing regime under General Franco, which called itself nationalist, and the Popular Front consisting of Republicans, Socialists and Communists to decide on who should rule. Hitler and Mussolini openly supported the repressive regime of General Franco, while Stalin helped the Popular Front. But Britain and France did not intervene, though some volunteers from both these countries and the United States fought in the war. Ultimately, the conflict remained local and General Franco emerged successful. This was seen as a victory for Mussolini and Hitler. In March 1938, Hitler occupied Austria. This was his first move in insolence of the Versailles Treaty outside Germany. This step increased the sense of crisis in Europe. Britain reacted by pressing for the policy of containment more urgently. In April, Britain signed a pact with Italy under which it recognized Italy's sovereignty in Ethiopia and returned for the withdrawal of Italian troops from Spain. The French did protest strongly, but they were not ready to risk war. By this time, it became clear that there would be a crisis over Czechoslovakia. It was connected to the German border and 3.5 million students, Germans, lived in this area. Hitler had described Czechoslovakia a dagger thrust into the heart of Germany. In a live broadcast on BBC radio, Chamberlain said that it would be horrible to fight because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom they knew nothing. To settle the matter by mediation, a conference was organized at Munich on 29 September 1938, which was attended by Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain and Daladier, the French Prime Minister. It was given a stark choice between handing over Sudetenland to Germany or of fighting alone. Hitler was allowed to annex Sudetenland provided he did not ask for more territory. After the conference, Chamberlain and Hitler even signed a paper stating that Britain and Germany would never go for war with one another again. Chamberlain was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for 1938. This Munich Agreement made Hitler extremely popular in Germany. In March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia as also Memel on the border of Lithuania. Hitler asked Poland to return the free city of Danzig to Germany. In this situation, Britain and France sought guarantees on the remaining free state of East Europe, Poland, Romania, Greece and Turkey. A popular joke that circulated at that time was, "A guarantee a day keeps Hitler away." Meanwhile, Britain and France speeded up their rearmament program. To demonstrate its seriousness, Britain announced conscription for all men aged 20 and 21 years. By this time, Mussolini was convinced that Germany was the strongest power in Europe. On 22nd May, Hitler and Mussolini signed what became known as the Pact of Steel, which was a 10-year political and military alliance. Hitler had decided to invade Poland. He knew that only Stalin could come to the assistance of Poland. Ultimately, on 23rd August 1939, Hitler signed the Non-Aggression Pact with Russia. Its secret clauses provided for the partition of Poland between them. This news came as a blow to Mussolini. When the Poles refused to accept Hitler's demand, he invaded Poland on 1st September 1939. The world watched this Nazi onslaught on Poland with horror. The first generation of historians after the Second World War was very critical of the policy of appeasement of Hitler followed by Britain and France. They saw it as an act of deliberate surrender on their part in the face of Hitler's deliberate bullying. In this context, Chamberlain came in for a lot of criticism. As early as 1941, he was described as the guiltiest of the guilty men and an epitome of cowardice. But during the last 2 decades of the 20th century, historians began to take a softer view of Chamberlain. Many have argued that the policy of appeasement represented a reasonable attempt to identify grievances and to respond to them sensibly. There were many people in Britain who felt that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh and that Italy and Germany had genuine grievances. Moreover, the experiences of the First World War were still fresh and public opinion was strongly pacifist. In both countries, public opinion dreaded the prospect of another war and welcomed diplomatic initiatives. The Second World War started when Britain and France decided to prevent Hitler from conquering Poland and declared war on 3rd September. They did not take a confrontationist stand till Hitler was expanding in Central Europe. It has been argued that the war saw a 30-year war from 1914 to 1945 and that in 1918 it was suspended temporarily. It is also important to remember that the aims of Germany, Italy and Japan went far beyond the revision of the Treaty of Versailles. Other European states also failed to find solutions to their domestic and international problems after 1918. This provided opportunities to ambitious dictators to come to power. The origins of the Second World War lay in the following. First, the deep resentment in Germany, Italy and Japan from the settlement of 1919, which was inflamed by uncertainties unleashed by the Great Depression. The rise of fascist forces in these three states, whose ambitions extended far beyond revising the 1919 settlement, but Italy was a relatively poor country and Japan remained active only in the Far East. It was the emergence of Germany as a powerhouse under a very ambitious leader, Hitler, that proved decisive. Third, the willingness of other powers, particularly Britain and France as also the United States, to accept expansions as long as their own interests were not directly threatened. Fourth, the eventual determination to halt German expansion even at the cost of war. Seen in this light, the Second World War was one more round of endless competition amongst sovereign states of power and security. Now, we will discuss the course of the war. The Second World War was qualitatively different from all wars which preceded it. In the Second World War, for the first time, civilians also had to directly face the force of war due to air raids and bombing on towns. The German army attacked Poland at 4:40 am on 1st September 1939. This opening move started the Second World War. The defeat of Poland was only a matter of time. The Luftwaffe, German Air Force, bombed the Polish airfields, bases, training centers and disrupted the entire railway network of Poland. In the face of highly mechanized, armored German attack, the Polish resistance went down and Britain and France could do nothing to save Poland. On 17 September, Russians invaded Poland from the east. As a result, Poland was divided between Germany and Russia. Since Russia was concerned with the safety of Leningrad, she attacked Finland in November 1939. Russia thought that a German conquest of Finland would endanger her security. The Russo-Finnish War ended in March 1940 with a peace treaty between Russia and Finland, through which Russia received a naval base in Finland. During this period, Russia also annexed and established military bases in Baltic state of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. The French and the Germans reinforced their respective lines of defense, the Maginot and Siegfried lines. This period of 5 months is known as the Phoney War, for no major offensive were launched. However, on 9th April 1940, the German army launched an offensive on Denmark and Norway, thus ending the period of Phoney War. Denmark surrendered quickly and Norway was defeated with the active support of Norwegian Nazis and their leader. Control of Norway was an important consideration for Germany, as Sweden was a major supplier of iron ore to Germany and Sweden's supply used to come through Norway. The conquest of Norway secured an uninterrupted supply of iron ore for Germany, which directly helped the German arms manufacturing industry. On 10th May 1940, the German army launched a simultaneous attack on Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg and ultimately France. Cities, bases and communication systems were bombed and a vast stretch of frontier was crossed by the German army. Nearly 1,000 people were killed by the bombing of Rotterdam. Holland surrendered within 4 days, while Luxembourg surrendered within just a few hours. Although Belgium tried to withstand German advances, they also surrendered after 17 days on 2nd May. Only Dunkirk remained in Allied hands, where a large number of Allied troops took shelter. On 26th May started the evacuation of 350,000 troops from Dunkirk, which ended on 4th June. The troops had to leave behind all their heavy equipments and weaponry at Dunkirk, and so Dunkirk was a serious blow for the Allies. The Germans moved southwards and concentrated their attack on France. Paris was captured on 14th June and France surrendered on 22nd June 1940. At Hitler's insistence, a ceasefire was signed at Campaign in the same railway carriage in which the Germans were compelled to sign the Versailles Peace Treaty in 1918. The Germans annexed northern France and the Atlantic coast. The remaining territory of France was allowed to be ruled under Henri Petain's government. This was a puppet government which collaborated with the Nazis and which came to be known as the Vichy government. After having conquered continental Europe, Hitler now decided to launch a direct attack on England. To conquer England, it was necessary to try to gain control of the English Channel, which could only be achieved by destroying the Royal Air Force or RAF and the Royal Navy. The plan for the attack of England was given the code name of Operation Sea Lion. The German offensive started in the month of August 1940 when German bombers bombed British ships, seaports, harbors, airfields, aircrafts and factories. This idea was to destroy the morals of RAF and its installations and to declare the route to London. The Luftwaffe also started to raid Britain's cities, particularly London, and heavy bombing continued. But the Britishers gave a very stiff resistance to Germans. There were battles between the RAF and Luftwaffe in the skies above southern England as well as RAF raids on Germany. This aerial conflict between Britain and Germany is known as the Battle of Britain. Due to the stiff British resistance, both civilians and military German air raids on London decreased, and by 17 September 1940, Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. The Tripartite Pact was signed between Germany, Italy and Japan on 27 September 1940, by which they pledged to give full support to each other. In October 1940, by which they pledged to give full support to each other, in October 1940, Italy invaded Greece, but although they met resistance backed by the British, the Germans ultimately triumphed and occupied Crete. From November of 1940 to March 1941, Germany conquered Hungary, Romania, Slovakia and Bulgaria. In April, Yugoslavia was subjugated and then partitioned between Germany and her allies. During this time in Africa, Italy invaded British Somaliland and Sudan and started to advance towards Egypt, although by the end of 1940, Britain had recovered most of her colonies in Africa after fighting. In Libya, fighting continued between the British and German-Italian combined forces. As has been mentioned earlier, General de Gaulle of France recognized Free France movement at that time. To Hitler, communism was the greatest enemy. Hitler had always maintained that the real war of Nazis will be against the Russians. Apart from this political ideological factor, there were also economic reasons for which Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that conquest of Russia would enable Nazi Germany to control a vast amount of natural resources. Hitler was worried that the Russians would attack Germany if the German forces remained engaged in Western Europe. Hitler also calculated that if Germany attacked Russia from the west, then Japan would start attacking Russia from the east. The German invasion of the Soviet Union started on 22 June 1941. It was a huge operation supported by 3,550 tanks and 5,000 aircrafts and was code-named Operation Barbarossa. Germany occupied Riga, Kiev, Smolensk and Odessa. However, they could not capture Leningrad and Moscow. The Russians started their counter-attack during the December when the temperature fell below 40 degrees Celsius. Severe cold halted the German advance and the Russians drove them back from the Moscow. The biggest blow to Germany was given by Russia in the Battle of Stalingrad in July 1942. The Russians fought hard and ultimately German Field Marshal von Paulus surrendered on 24 January 1943. To Germany, it was a moral and political defeat and with a high military cost. The German invasion of Russia brought England, the US and Russia closer. This cooperation and unity of the UK, USA and the USSR later largely contributed to the final defeat and surrender of Germany. The anti-fascist coalition of the countries came to be known as the Grand Alliance. Involvement of Japan and US in the Second World War. Before 1941, the US maintained neutrality in the Second World War. The US government allowed a uniform policy towards Britain and France. From 1941, however, the US Congress passed a law by which the President was given the power to lend or lease arms to those countries whose defense was considered vital to the defense of the US. As a result, Britain and Russia started to receive a huge supply of arms from the US. In August 1941, the US, Britain and the USSR declared the Atlantic Charter and gave a call for the final destruction of the Nazi Germany. Japanese imperialism was, however, taking shape at that time. Japan had already occupied Vietnam. Now, Japan's desire was to control the Pacific. Already, the relationship between the US and Japan had deteriorated when the US demanded Japanese withdrawal from Indochina and China. On 7 December 1941, the Japanese Air Force bombed on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. On 8 December, the US declared war. On 11 December, Germany and Italy declared war on the US and US reciprocated. So, from mid-1941, when the Soviet Union got involved in the war, and in the last month of that year, when the US also became involved, the war took the form of a global or world war. Defeat of Italy and Mussolini's fall. Allied forces invaded Sicily on 9 July 1943, beginning the final assault on Italy. There was already internal disagreement in Italy, and repeated defeats broke the morale of the Italian soldiers, who frequently surrendered themselves to the Allied forces. The internal political crisis of Italy resulted in the arrest of Mussolini on 26 July 1943. On 3rd September, the Allied forces invaded southern Italy, and due to the initiative of Victor Emmanuel, Italy surrendered. However, the Germans invaded northern Italy on 10th September and occupied Rome. Later, Mussolini was rescued by Hitler, and he established a government in northern Italy under German protection. In southern Italy, a new government was formed which declared war against Germany, and civil war followed. Mussolini was later captured in 1945 and was shot by the Italians. Allied invasion of Europe on 26 June 1944. While facing the Nazi onslaught in Eastern Europe, Russia called for the opening up of Second Front. Russia's opinion, if, was that the Allies started attacking the Nazi army from the west, then the concentration of German forces on Russia would be reduced and diverted. For strategic reasons, the US and the UK declined to open the Second Front before 1944. On 2nd June 1944, however, Allied troops landed on the beaches of the Normandy on the north coast of France. This event is known as D-Day and took months of preparation and innovative intelligence work to effect successfully. The Allied armies liberated France and Belgium by September 1944. After the surrender of Italy in 1943, the civil war in Italy continued. The anti-fascist movement inside Italy grew stronger by the day, and anti-fascists started an uprising in the fascist-occupied northern Italy on 23 April 1945. Allied forces freed Rome in 1944, and with the execution of Mussolini in 1945, Italy became free from fascist rule. Germany was attacked by the Allies from the west and Soviet Union from the east, and by March 1945, Allied forces occupied a large amount of territory in West Germany. On 25th April, Soviet forces reached Berlin. Realizing the imminence of defeat, Hitler committed suicide on 30th April 1945. On 7th May, Germany unconditionally surrendered to representatives of the UK, the US, France and the USSR. The war continued in Asia Pacific region for nearly another 4 months. The only excess force of this region was Japan, who was waging war in China, Manchuria, Korea and Southeast Asia. To force Japanese surrender on 6 August 1945, the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and on 9th August another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. On 8th August, the Soviet Union also declared war against Japan, and these combined pressures ultimately forced Japan to retreat. Chinese communists defeated them in China, the Soviet Union in Manchuria and the British Army in Southeast Asia. On 2nd September 1945, Japan also surrendered, and with this the Second World War officially came to an end. Post-war settlement. No grand peace conference was convened after the Second World War. A conference of Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, was held at Yalta in the Crimea during 4 to 11 February 1945, where they agreed on a partition not only of Europe but of the world. Several crucial decisions were taken. It was decided that in place of the League of Nations, a new organization, namely the United Nations Organization, would be established. On the German question, it was decided that Germany was to be totally defeated and subjected to Allied occupation. It was to be divided into 4 occupation zones, each to be garrisoned by one of the Allies and France. Berlin, which fell in the Russian zone, was to be similarly divided into zones. Similar arrangements was made for Austria. It was agreed that Germany would pay reparation and the Russia would have a strong claim to the highest possible indemnity. After its surrenders, Germany was crushed in a manner that was unprecedented, at least in modern times. In fact, Germany temporarily disappeared from the map. It was also decided that Germany would be denazified, though it was not clear how. After Germany surrendered, another conference was held at Potsdam from 17th July to 2nd August 1945, led by Stalin and Churchill, who was replaced by Clement Attlee, when the latter became the Prime Minister after the Labour Party won the elections in Britain. They had a massive agenda. As already said, it took up the issue of surrender by Japan. A council of foreign ministers of the 3 powers and France was created to deal with the defeated European countries, Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania and Finland. Meaning of the Second World War for the Europeans and for the rest of the world. A broad spectrum of nations, social groups and political parties participated in a war which indeed became a total war. The estimate of the number of persons who died in the Second World War lies in the range 50 to 55 million. there were some areas that escaped actual fighting, North and South America, much of America and the Indian subcontinent. Yet these regions too paid a price even in human terms. The apparatus of a modern state and technological advancements were brutally used to create horrific ordeals. The peculiarity of Second World War was that most civilians died as a result of calculated decisions made by policymakers. Systematic killing through city bombing became an acceptable war strategy during this war. Those responsible for taking major decisions in all the countries worked to win wars through a systematic elimination of city populace that included children, the old, and the infirm. The saga of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is well known. The Japanese too slaughtered thousands of civilians in China. The treatment meted out to prisoners by the Japanese were appalling. Many of the prisoners were employed along with forced Asian labor on the construction of railway lines. The Second World War was savage also because of the manner in which each side came to view the other as inferior or even subhuman. It is well known that the Nazis aimed at the final solution. By killing all Jews, Hitler's fanatic hatred of Jews, culminating in the Holocaust, is beyond rational explanation. What is significant is that ruthlessness was shown not just by the Germans. The behavior of Americans and Japanese were nastily racist. They saw the Japanese as an inferior race. The Japanese fought the Westerners with the slogan Asia for the Asians, but they considered themselves superior to the Koreans, the Chinese, and other lesser races among the Asian people. Another form that human misery took was forcible migration of people during the last months of the war. Some 15 million persons were forced to migrate. The war had a decisive impact on international relations. One lasting legacy was the demise of a European-centric world. The British fought through the whole war from the first to last, and until 1944, Britain and its empire had more troops engaged in combat with the enemy than the Americans. But the cost of this war weakened Britain, and it asked for the support, for economic and political, from the United States. The post-war world was dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The latter had made a massive contribution to the war and held that it was entitled to reward. It was in control of half of Europe. The United States represented modernity. Europe became divided down the middle, with the Soviet Union virtually controlling the eastern half and the United States dominating the western half. After the war, the two countries found it impossible to agree on the shape of the post-war world. The United States saw itself as champion of capitalism, free markets, and liberalization. The war introduced new and complicating factors in international relations. After this war, there was a troubling sense that the great powers could have avoided the war by taking a strong stand against Hitler in time. Moreover, a feeling also emerged that something should have been done to save the European Jews. The crimes against humanity and the publicity these got created sensitivity towards human rights, and gradually, partially on the initiatives of the United Nations, a human rights movement emerged in the world. In contravention of the tradition of minding one's own business, many begin to feel that world cannot be unconcerned about events inside other countries. The war in different ways strengthened anti-colonial nationalist movements everywhere. In South Africa, Afrikaner opposition to the war led to increased antipathy to British connection. In Asia, even before the war, nationalist movements had emerged. The Japanese made a gesture towards India's independence too by supporting Subhash Chandra Bose. However, the main purpose of the Japanese was to create the new order in East Asia, which would serve their own interest in Asia and then in the world. This defeat of colonial powers by Japan and then defeat of Japan roused liberation struggles in the countries of Asia and Africa. The Western folklore has it that after the Second World War, the European powers were so exhausted that they decided to abdicate from their colonial positions, and gradually countries in Asia and Africa became free. The loss of prestige suffered in this war increased the desire of the French and the Dutch to reconquer their empire in the colonies. They gave up their empires only when they could not withstand opposition from the people in the colonies itself. It was not their intention to leave these colonies. The Second World War left a permanent impact on culture. The unprecedented destruction, unimaginable atrocities, the Holocaust, aerial attack on the civilian population, and the explosion of the atomic bomb seemed to discredit civilization itself in the Second World War. Let's stop here. Thank you very much.